I've got two little kids, one 10, one 9, and they will do anything to avoid bedtime. Anything. So they're all into the debate. Mary Jane is sitting next to me on my left. I'm sitting here, we're watching. Corey's on the far side. My nephew's in the middle. Christina's as close to Corey as she can be, and they're both like on fours, just looking at the TV like it's the most interesting thing ever. And then Mary Jane sits back and she's like, Dad. I'm like, what? She's like, he just called her a liar. I said, yes, he did. And she just called him a liar. Yes, she did. Who's telling the truth? And I said, what if they're both lying? It blew her mind. You mean they would both lie? I said, at the very minimum, they are both withholding aspects of the truth. So you tell me, because that's lying. You told me that's lying. That's lying. They're both lying. And then it went silent. She watched, and she listened, and she kept looking at her watch. Like, what is she doing? She finally sits back in complete astonishment. And she's like, Dad, they have told more lies in 2 minutes than I've told in 2 months. And you're just like, I don't know what her measure of truth was in that conversation, but it was really interesting. It was like I wish I had popcorn just watching her watch the debate. It was so fun. So we want to get into something. We're talking about this, follow me. How do I unite to Jesus in a politically divided world? And this morning I want to walk us into a conversation. What's the easiest sin in particular for Christians to commit, but for all of us to commit in an election year? The easiest sin. One of my favorite research projects I ever worked on was on the 7 deadly sins. Now, as Protestants or evangelicals, good Baptists you may call yourself. If you didn't know that we're a Baptist church, you can leave now. No, please stay. We do have roots in a Baptist church. You may not know that. But you may not actually pay attention to the broader scope of Christian theology. And within that context, there's something called the 7 deadly sins. You ever hear of the 7 deadly sins? So it roots in Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16. And Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16 says, there are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 we say that he detests. And then the rest of Proverbs 6 will start to unfold what those sins are. And that's where we get this idea of the 7 deadly sins. Now, these aren't sins that, if you don't know, the Bible actually tells us every sin is deadly, because every sin is a marker of us being separate from God. Jesus would say there's a way that you could go that leads to destruction, a very broad path, but the narrow road leads to righteousness. The Proverbs writer would echo, there's a way that seems right to man, but in the end, it leads to death. And that's just the way of sin. Sin separates us from God. Sin breaks our relationship with other people. And when we get into an election year season, we see these tensions. Paul would write in Ephesians chapter 4, I love the way the RSV puts it, don't make room for the devil. Isn't that fun? Sin seeks an opportunity to push into our lives. The devil hates God, hates everything that is from God, and a righteous life, a gift through Christ, comes from the Lord, hates that. So to destroy you, which is what we see as this devil's mission, right? He prowls around like an angry lion looking to devour each one, the scripture tells us. Pushing into our lives, and we're told to make no room for sin or the devil. And when we see Scripture, we're actually told that most sin that comes from temptation doesn't actually come from the devil. It actually comes from your own wickedness. There's a celebration for a Sunday morning. We come out of that great song Kim just sang, and now the pastor's like total buzzkill, like you're completely wicked. There you go. Right? And so how do we live into this? Like if we're not to make any room for sin or evil, what do we do? And how do we live? In particular, in a world where it's quite easy to get into these things. So we look at it. There are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 he detests. So what I want to do is I want to walk through all 7 of these deadly sins quickly and show you how they consume us, any of us, not just Christians, but any person during an election season. And then we'll get into the easiest sin to commit. So here we go. Gluttony. Gluttony is the excess consumption of anything. Now, let's put that in the election season, the excess consumption of political news and commentary. Like you can't get enough of it. It takes every waking moment, every thought, and you consume and you consume and you consume and you consume. And we talked about that whole echo chamber mentality. If you weren't with us last week, I invite you to go watch it on YouTube. But hearing these same things, and we just consume it, and we scroll, and we consume it, and we scroll, and we click, and we watch, and we read, and we watch, and we click, and we read, and we consume. And it takes over our lives. The consumption of it. Paying attention to the world isn't wrong. Being consumed by the world and the intake of that information actually can be a mark of gluttony. Gluttony isn't just about food. It's about the excessive consumption of what's around us. It could be video games, it could be sports, it could be your fantasy football team. It could be your 401k. The things that we excessively consume would line our souls up with acts of gluttony. There's a fantastic book. We attribute it to St. Augustine, but the Lutherans still use it quite often, and it's just called the Prayer Book of St. Augustine. We're not real for sure if Augustine actually wrote it, but the Lutherans use it most, and he walks us through, in that prayer book, the writer walks us through how all these sins are intertwined, and it's not just about the one thing, food, it's about so much more. And gluttony is one of those things we can easily get into. How about sloth? Sloth, we often think about being lazy, right? We're being slothful, we're being lazy. But what about giving attention, the attention we rightly owe elsewhere, and setting our attention on a never-ending stream of campaign news? That's really slothfulness. There's an attention that we are to give to the world, give to the Lord, give to loving God and neighbor. And when we take that attention away, like we rightly owe it, like that's the greatest commandment, right? To love God with everything we have, love our neighbor as ourselves, which calls us to legitimately doing something in the world. And rather we sit back, not doing anything, and we give our attention to so much else. Sloth and gluttony are directly related. Sloth doesn't vote at all, or it votes without understanding. It abstains not out of conviction that kingdom work lies elsewhere, but out of apathy or insensibility. Last week we talked about one of the challenges to really bear witness as believers in this kind of season and this kind of country with this kind of voting system. Part of what we can do is actually actively know the issues well. Like know the issues, not just a cited argument, but know the issues. Know the candidates. I would challenge you to not walk into a room and check a box that says Republican because you've always voted Republican, or to check a box that says Democrat because you've always voted Democrat. Know the candidates. Know what they stand for. Know the issues. Don't vote without understanding. Give legitimate concern. If you're really concerned, give legitimate concern over the next couple of months to know what you're getting into when you walk into that voting chamber. Know what's going on. Don't be slothful with what you have. Engage the world. Envy. Envy in the election season refuses to see anyone or anything else superior to self. I saw that in the debate from both participants. They refused to give credit on either side. There was no vision for America being cast. There was accusations on why they couldn't do anything for America, both sides. It was just accusation. They refused to see anything superior to themselves. Envy will debunk and destroy or deny pure motive and reject expertise. So that now we have a beautiful new phrase that echoes envy in the world. That's fake news. And some of it is, which means I can't be slothful or gluttonous about my intake of the news. I got to pay attention to stuff. But envy will look at something, and rather than, and alongside fake news, we now have another new phrase, fact check. Right? That's not so new. The Bereans did it first. They understood the times and they checked the scriptures based on what Paul was saying about Jesus. They were fact checking. We could do the same. It's significant. But we shouldn't be so quick to say fake news if there's truth to be found. But that means we have some work to do. Envy can't just run the soul that way. Pride keeps us from seriously entertaining any political perspective other than our own. It assures us that we're right. We're not like other people. Luke, the accusation, right, from the rich man and Lazarus, I'm not like those people over there. Thank you, Lord, I'm not like them. But you and I are so good together, and my political beliefs are so solid that no one else could possibly be right. There's nothing else to consider. And pride runs the political world today. We can't listen to each other because pride deafens our soul. It deafens our understanding. We're not sharp. We're just defensive. We're not really trying to find solutions. We're just trying to defend ourselves. Pride. Greed. Greed only seeks its own good, especially during election time, never concerning itself with the good of others too. We're pretty well versed with politicians being filled with pride and greed. We don't often think about those who support the politicians being filled with pride or greed. Right? Like, they get there on the shoulders of people who affirm them. Right? And so how do we do that? So greed asks, how will this help me, but never looks at how will this benefit my neighbor. My son and I were talking recently, and he had a really beautiful observation. He said, we no longer live in a world where it's us and them. He says, Dad, I think we live in a world where it's us and not us. Does that make sense? Differently from us and them, us and not us. And it actually creates a more staunch division and separates entirely the other group, whomever the other group is. It's the kind of thing where Jesus says, those who are with me are not against me. And it creates this tension, but Jesus wasn't talking politics. He was talking salvation. Because the system of the Pharisees and the system of Rome, two different religious opportunities, were fighting the salvation of God brought through Jesus. Jesus came, he says, to seek and to save the lost, to bear witness to the truth. And those systems of both the Jews and the Romans were fighting against the revelation of God's salvation through Jesus. They couldn't see it. And they wanted to hold on to what they had. They never looked to see how this can benefit others. And they never looked to see the oppression that they put on others so long as they could stay in power. That's a greed move. To hold on to power is a move based in greed. And when you listen to both of the primary parties in the United States, it's not about the benefit of the country. It's about winning the position. And when winning the position is the sole goal of our politics, we've actually lost sight on how do we love neighbor well as a society, if that's a societal goal. It's a Christian goal. It's a Christian command. Goals aren't necessarily commands. But to benefit and love others, that is a command. Love your neighbor as yourself. Command. And so we get into these power struggles and we want to maintain, and we lose all sight of other for the sake of winning. Greed. Lust. In its broader sense, lust is an inordinate, self-gratifying desire. A lot of times we attribute lust simply to a sexual connotation. But there is a lust for life, at least according to Iggy Pop. And when you think about this dynamic about life and lust and power, this is one of those pieces, right? I want it all. It's an inordinate, self-gratifying desire. Power is its favorite political object. And what we have is never enough. And I would insert here, maybe interject, that this is the place where Christians have most struggled in the United States, not globally, but in the United States. Whatever happened post-World War II, in particular post-World War II, there was still a development of power that was largely driven by Christian identity. Maybe not the Christian faith as a whole, but by those who identified as Christian. And you think about it, it's the Mrs. Cleaver days, when the reality is we're all Jimmy Haskell, right? And then those hippies took over, and the dishonesty of a Nixon politic started to corrupt our view of things. And we wrestled through these dynamics, and political power began to find alignments and allotments and the tension of holding on to what we have. And there was a moment in the United States that we might have been able to say, at the very minimum, a Christian-ish majority led the country. I don't like saying Christian because I don't think it was truly committed to Jesus. But there were some conservative values that led the way on both sides of the party lines. And as that power has slowly decreased in its influence in the social world in which we now live, you hear the echoes of a broader fight. One group sees the opportunity to hold on to those values as a power move. The other group hears the echoes of a society moving away from those values and sees that as a power grab. And both are moving in a direction that isn't unifying or vision casting for the well-being of the American people, but for holding on to the power in the position. What we have is never enough, and then it gets manipulated. Wrath. This one's fun. This is like where we live right now. Like anger and wrath, that is the broadest context of the social environment, right? Like we are a very angry people. It's not just road rage anymore. Wrath may be defined as bitterness indulged and accommodated. So you're not just angry about something, you're not just bitter about something, you're actually making accommodation for it. And finding that habit, right, made into a habit of mind that colors our encounters with those frustrating people on the other side who can't or won't see what seems to be clear to the rest of us. If they just saw the clear moral choice, there would be nothing to do. But those people over there, they're the enemy. They're the ones who aren't doing what is just obviously clear and good and right. And if you listen to both sides of the argument, you don't know who the enemy is. Unless they're clearly talking about you, and then you go, oh, well, I can never go along with someone like that. And then you go find your own places to stir wrath. Right? Like they refuse to go along with what's good and right according to who? To the broader culture? To the political alignment? To your observations? Because, truth be told, neither of those parties represent the kingdom. Neither of those parties are Jesus-centric, gospel-forward. They have their own agenda. Jesus' agenda is to make disciples, to rescue the world from sin, to restore brokenness back into relationship with God. Neither of those parties share that mission. So what do you do? And quite often, when a believer in Jesus gets misaligned, we start to see not just the trickle down, but the full outpouring of these 7 deadly sins, so to speak, in the lives of individual Christians and oftentimes within the churches where we worship. Now, those may be the deadliest, but they're not the easiest. No. The easiest, it happens just with a click of a button, a like, or a share, or a lunchtime conversation. The absolute easiest sin to commit at election time for anybody is slander. I like the way you slammed your book at the right time. That was like total emphasis. Could you be back second hour and do that again? That was perfect. Slander. Slander is the absolute easiest sin to commit at election time. We talk about slander. What we mean by slander is this. Slander is telling lies about others with the intent of hurting them. But it's easy to do. When I listen to Mary Jane's observation, they've told more lies in 2 minutes than I've told in 2 months. You go, a lot of that phrasing wasn't just lies about activities, it was statements about the person and the finger pointing across the microphones. You know, slander is one of the big 10, by the way. It's in there. Exodus 20:16 tells us quite clearly, do not bear false witness. And as believers in Jesus, we will ignore it. Now, just to be quite frank, like the 10 Commandments is a phrase that got added to the Bible later in terms of like its headlines and stuff. God actually thinks his entire word is important and invites us to follow every single bit of it. But in that breakdown of what we call the Decalogue or the 10 laws, like we have that one, right? It's in there. Do not bear false witness, Exodus 20:16. I love what the psalmist has to say about it, though. The psalmist says this about slander. In Psalm 101, verse 5, he says, I will destroy anyone who secretly slanders his neighbor. I cannot tolerate anyone with haughty eyes or an arrogant heart. Well, that's not a good song to sing. I mean, Kim sings all these, like, listen to this, right? I will sing praise to the Lord. I will sing of your faithful love and justice. I will pay attention to the way of integrity. When you come to me, I will live with a heart of integrity in my house. I will not let anything worthless guide me. I hate the practice of sin. It will not cling to me. A devious heart will be far from me. I will not be involved with evil. I will destroy anyone who secretly slanders his neighbor. I cannot tolerate anyone with haughty eyes or an arrogant heart. My eyes favor the faithful of the land so that they may sit down with me. The one who follows the way of integrity may serve with me. No one who acts deceitfully can serve in this palace. The one who tells lies will not be retained to guide me. Every morning I want to destroy the wicked of the land and wipe out evildoers from the Lord's city. This is the cry of someone who has watched his land suffer the weight of sin, including his own. David was well aware of his sin. And this is written after the Lord had restored him from his affair with Bathsheba. And we see that. And then the hard part is as believers in Jesus, we so often join in the activities rather than separate from. And we start to think of things like our right to free speech. Well, that's true so long as your tongue isn't surrendered to Jesus. James chapter 3 would actually argue that a slanderous tongue is the work of demonic forces. That's how evil slander is, according to James. Slander, telling lies about others with the intent to hurt them. Or maybe it's not the lie you tell, it's the post that you share that degrades the character of someone else. I don't know if you know this or not. How did the old kids song go? Red and yellow, black and white, all are precious in his sight. Yeah, and Jesus loves the Republican children and the Democrat children. Right? Like we often confuse that one stands for Jesus and one doesn't, and I would just argue that none of them stand for Jesus, so Jesus has to stand over them. He loves them. Right? And we often get into a place where we create all this slander, right? Slander, according to one thinker, is cowardice twice over. And here's why it's cowardice. One, it's often done behind someone's back. I don't know about you. I just finger pointed right there, right? I don't know about you, but in the political post that you've shared, I have never sat down one day with Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. One day. I would argue that probably most of you haven't either. And if you have, that's a cool story to share. And I would probably argue that when you did sit down with them, you didn't show them your Facebook feed or your Instagram feed. Or the things that you did share, you spoke to them directly. So all the things that we post, even though they may, I don't think they're following me on Facebook, by the way. Which means it's still behind their back, right? Like it's an act that it is a fearful act. It's a cowardice act. We do it behind people's backs. And then most of the time, we slander with people who already agree with us. Because when you say something that someone doesn't agree with, you're not slandering, you're arguing, and then you're just throwing mud, and you're both kind of probably in a slandering fight at that point. Go have coffee with someone who's politically different from you and just tell them how terrible their candidate is. And watch what happens. You will be accusing each other as much as the debate did the other night. But not to the people's faces either. It's so much easier to slander the people who already agree with us. And then we draw them into it as well. Slander by Christians is that space where we talk ill of another person or a political party because we cannot see how Jesus is represented in the other person's views. That's slander at its best. And just so you know, slander is always at its worst. At best, we're trying to figure out how the other party aligns with Jesus. At best. And we're still degrading and putting people down. And degrading and putting people down who disagree with us about those things. In Proverbs chapter 10, verse 18, the Proverbs writer reflects on slander. And if I can't encourage you to move beyond slander in your life, perhaps he can. The one who conceals hatred has lying lips, but whoever spreads slander is a fool. I never one day woke up wanting to be a fool. Some days I've woken up and acted like a fool. Right? Sometimes it takes until about 4:30 in the afternoon, but it will happen. But I've never marked my calendar. What am I going to do on Wednesday? Act like a fool. It's never hit my calendar. But the Proverbs writer says the one who spreads slander is a fool. Not like a fool, is a fool. Which means we really have to watch, if you believe in Jesus, the stuff you're putting on your Facebook feeds, your Instagram feeds, the reels that you share. We have to be careful. We are not witnesses for the Democrats or the Republicans. We are witnesses of King Jesus. That's it. And when people know that you're a witness of Jesus and then you speak like a fool, what does that say about Jesus? If this is how Jesus' people behave, why do I want to do that? What about slander toward Christians? This happens as well. I was at a summit for Christian pastors on Thursday, and it was wrestling with some of the political dynamics among African American conservative Christian voters. A question was asked, are you evangelical? And the African American voter would check no. Because at their core, even though their political alignment would be conservative, right? They didn't want to be aligned with the phrase evangelical because that feels too politically loaded in the environment in which we live. In that same survey, it was found that Muslim voters checked that they were evangelical because they understood the political alignment and went, yeah, that's what I think. Had nothing to do with belonging to Jesus or not. An African American voter whose values would most line up with what is called the Republican Party today refused to check the box evangelical time and time again in the research because it was so politically motivated. They're like, we're not like that person over there. But the Muslim man saw the political connotation and went, yep, I'm like that. Let's go. And when you talk about slander toward Christians, this is part of what happens. That the belief, and when you think about what an evangelical is, they are focused on the Bible, they are focused on salvation through Jesus, they are focused on conversion, people saying yes to Jesus. Like when you look at the theological world and the distinctives of evangelical, they're very different than what the media would say, even the conservative media would say about what evangelical is. So we're trying to distance ourselves from really beautiful, powerful things because of the accusation in the world. And then we get into like voting values, things that deal with like sexual identity and marriage, things that deal with like abortion, economic policies. And we start to look at those things and we get threatened by those things, or maybe more so, we think God is threatened by those things, and we got to defend those beliefs and fight for those beliefs. And then people tell us about our fight and how we've actually been slandering or say other things about the Christian, and that puts us in a space of being slandered against if you follow Jesus. So how do you respond to a world that may actually slander you for your faith? In a political season especially, what do you do? I love the example of Jesus. In Matthew 26, Jesus has been arrested. He is standing before the Sanhedrin, a legal group of Pharisees and Sadducees. They are accusing him of all sorts of things. People say you're the Son of God. People say that you're the King of the Jews. People say this, people say that. People say this, people say that. What do you have to say for yourself? And it says, Matthew 26:63, although they accused him, Jesus said nothing. I am more likely to exercise my freedom of speech at you than my freedom of speech for you. Freedom means you can also be silent, intentionally silent, so not to bear false witness, not against the person, but against our Lord. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 16. Peter is talking to a world that has been scattered. The church is in Asia Minor. The church has been broadly scattered from Jerusalem, from Antioch. There's been crazy persecution. People are dying and for their faith. The Roman government hates them. The Jews hate them. Everybody hates them. And Peter writes this letter to the churches scattered across Asia Minor. And in it, he talks about working for people who are harsh and people accusing you over false things. They're bearing false witness against you. And Peter actually tells us in that conversation, 1 Peter 3:16, that we should be silent. We should be silent so that by our actions and good behavior, our witness will move forward. That when you have a harsh manager or an accusation against you, you should live life so well, that for no matter what the accusation is, it's like water on a duck's back. It can't stick. It rolls off. The Spirit of God in you is the ultimate Teflon, if you live in obedience to the Word. Nothing can stick. The validation of our character, empowered by the Spirit within us, allows us to live in a vile and God-rejecting world in such a way that looks beautiful to them. And that's how we combat sin in a world that is marred and mired with slander and lies, especially at election time. Not by throwing more mud, but by living so well the accusation can't stick. And that's witness.